Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Out at Work, The Power of Authenticity webinar. Before we get started, I just want to address a couple of items for you guys, a couple of housekeeping areas. The first is I want to introduce the members of the Alumni Association that are on the webinar tonight. My name is Megan Hoyo. I'm the Alumni Officer for Professional and Affinity Networks, as well as the Office Liaison for the UMass Amherst LGBTQ Alumni Network that's presenting this webinar tonight. And Karen?
Hi, I'm Karen Schultz-Battistoni. I'm the Manager of Professional and Alumni Volunteer Services, and I focus on career programming and volunteer programming for alumni. Happy to be here tonight.
Excellent. Today's speaker is Beck Bailey. Beck graduated from UMass in 2014 with an MBA from the Eisenberg School of Management, and he currently serves as the Deputy Director for the HRC's Workplace Equality Program. Before I turn it over to Beck, a couple of other items to note. The webinar tonight will be recorded for future use. So by being on the webinar, you are consenting to being recorded. And the second one is, at the end, we will have a question and answer period if time allows. If for some reason we run out of time, we will take the questions that you can submit in the chat box down at the bottom. If you hover your mouse towards the bottom of your screen, we will take those questions and submit them to Beck offline for his answering, and then I will send them over through email after the webinar. And with that, I will turn it over to Beck.
Well, awesome. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and get my screen up here so folks can see the presentation. Bear with me just a moment while we get that set up. And thank you so much to Megan and Karen for getting this set up for us, this opportunity to present to the Alumni Association and fellow graduates of UMass. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be able to do this work and to be here tonight. I want to start with just a little bit about the Human Rights Campaign and the Human Rights Campaign Foundation. We are our nation's largest lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer civil rights organization. And we're really organized in two parts. The campaign, which is our C4 political arm, that does legislative and lobbying work along with electoral work to change the laws of this country to be more inclusive and fair and equitable for LGBTQ people. And then the foundation, which is our public education and outreach arm, and that's the place where I sit in the foundation. And our programs in the foundation are organized around what I like to call the cradle to grave experience of life. And so we focus on major institutional change in those large institutions of our life. So schools, healthcare, religion and faith, all of those, college and university. We have a program that focuses on colleges and universities. And then the workplace program, because face it, most of us spend a majority of our adult waking life at work. And so this being one of those major institutions that really affects our lives. Our organization, there's a bunch of stats up here about our reach and our membership. The most important one for all of you tonight is about our website. And we say that we have 2 million visitors a month. That's because we have incredible amount of resources on our website for you. And at the end, we'll have a slide up that has a lot of resources from tonight's presentation, but just keep in mind that you can always go to www.hrc.org for information on the LGBTQ community. Our Workplace Equality Program, that's the program I sit in. We specialize in working with America's largest employers. So think the Fortune 1000 and also the top law firms, the American Law 200, on their workplace policies of inclusion for LGBTQ people. We do one-on-one consulting, we do training and education, presentations, And we do a lot of publications of guidance, white papers, case studies for the HR and diversity and inclusion professionals in large workplaces. And one of our signature pieces is the Corporate Equality Index. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little later on in the presentation. So let's start with just the premise of tonight. What is authenticity and what does it mean when we're thinking about the workplace and LGBTQ people? When I think about it, I always think of like me doing me and you doing you, right? Like being authentic, being able to be who you are and not censor yourself in terms of your everyday life in your workplace or professional setting. What happens for a lot of LGBTQ people is if they're unsure about how they're going to be received in their workplace, then there is that self-censoring. There's censoring around maybe sharing about their partner or husband or wife or other aspects of their family. They might not share on the same level as everyone else does. They might not share about what they did over the weekend because that would imply who they did that with, right? And so there's a lot of that kind of negotiating around whether or not people can be free to share on that everyday level at the workplace. And another place where LGBTQ people often censor themselves is around their presentation. And this isn't just transgender or genderqueer or gender fluid people, but really anyone whose gender expression may fall out of the societal norms of what is professional for people who are assigned female at birth or for women or for men. So imagine even a lesbian identified woman who is not transgender, but whose gender expression is a little more along the lines of suits and ties and pants and not, traditional female business suits. And does she feel comfortable in her gender expression in her professional workplace? Now, thinking about the business, I wanted to kind of start with building a business case around this authenticity, right? Like, what does it mean both personally and professionally and to the business itself if people can't be fully themselves in the workplace? And one of the places where HRC work to quantify or create data around the impact of being in the closet is in our climate report called The Cost of the Closet and the Rewards of Inclusion. And I'm going to go through a little bit of that report today. First, we asked folks, are you out at work? And the interesting part is, and you can see, we also asked about, are you out at home, which is the black, and are you out with friends? And you can see that in the workplace, the majority, just over half, are out to none or few, where that flips for with family and with friends. But just thinking about the workplace, isolating for the workplace right now, why are, with all of the kind of progress of our community, why is it still true that the majority of people, just over half, are still in the closet at work? Well, one of the things we know about that and why it matters is if people are in the closet, there's going to be some impact to their individual engagement, to their productivity, perhaps to their retention ultimately. And one of the things that our survey reveals, I can't go into all these details tonight, but if you happen to be an employer on the line or a manager or someone who works in HR, what's interesting about our survey and our report is that if LGBTQ people feel uncomfortable at work, chances are other folks around other marginalized populations are having challenges as well. So along lines of gender diversity, race, ability, and so on. And so the atmosphere or climate for LGBTQ people tracks on the climate across the broad spectrum of diversity in the workplace. So now we asked folks, what are some of the implications of not being able to be out at work? What are some of the behaviors that come up for you because of that? And this to us, it really speaks to the cost, and in this case, around engagement and productivity. I won't go through all of these, but let's pick out a few of the big ones. Felt distracted from work, 30%. Avoided a social event at work, such as lunch, happy hour, or a holiday party, 24%. Now, I want to give that some context because that's not just as simple as, oh, gee, poor Beck, he didn't come to the holiday party. Let's have a pity party for him, or he sits alone at the lunch table. That's so sad. It's not just about that, although we want to have a caring atmosphere for each other and our colleagues, but it's also about the reality that if I am someone, perhaps I self-censor, I don't come to the holiday party because I'm in a same-sex relationship and I don't feel like I could bring my husband to that holiday party and not, experience kind of raised eyebrows and whispers and discomfort. So I never show up to those things. And what happens is that I get kind of painted as an outsider, perhaps as someone who doesn't play well with others, isn't warm or open myself. And that colors my relationships across work, not only in those personal relationships, but with professional implication. And what I mean is, do you look at me then as the go-to guy for that next cherry prime team assignment? Do you look at me as that outgoing, connected team leader? Perhaps not, because I'm not participating in these social events. And that can have a real impact on my career over time as someone who's not chosen for those kind of plum assignments. We could talk more about that at the end. Had to lie about my personal life, 35%. That's significant, right? We talk about workplace ethics, we talk about authenticity in leadership. And if someone is withholding or even telling lies, coloring, maybe changing the pronouns of their partner so that they don't reveal that they're lesbian or gay or bi, then that can take a toll on a person personally around their own sense of their values and ethics, but also, again, create those kinds of distance and boundaries and barriers in team relationships and relationships with colleagues. Felt unhappy or depressed at work, 30%. Again, another area where this is about productivity. If you aren't feeling, engaged, if you're dealing with depression, these are going to affect overall productivity and the ability to perform. Now, one of the other costs of the closet is on retention, right? So turnover. If I am in the closet over time, that's taking that toll on me for all the reasons we've just talked about. It's perhaps dampening my professional experiences because I'm not getting picked for plum assignments. Or if I am out and I'm experiencing bias and harassment in the workplace, or even just very subtle, unwelcoming messages then I'm going to move on, right? I'm going to leave. And so the cost of the closet is also on turnover. Our report found that 9%, so 1 in 10 of LGBT employees reported that they left the jobs specifically because the environment was not accepting. And when you are thinking about all the HR and talent management folks who are trying to get at what keeps employees there and engaged, this is a big number. And the cost of turnover, for those of us who work in this field, know that that can be significant. Anywhere from 2 to 20 times a person's base salary to replace them in that position. So significant business case and reasons to look to keep folks. Now, I told you that we called this report The Cost of the Closet and the Rewards of Inclusion. So what are some of those rewards of inclusion? Certainly, we talked about the flip side of all of those costs, which is more engagement, more productivity, more innovation by having your employees completely present and engaged, but also retention. One of the key data points we found is that 1 in 4 employees reported staying in a job specifically because the environment was inclusive. That's a huge payback. That's a loyalty factor that folks who work in talent management are looking for all the time. It wasn't the pay, it wasn't the benefits, it was the atmosphere. And that is a really incredible reward to get for investing in an inclusive workplace. So what are some of those benefits of being out at work? Reducing that stress that we talked about, reducing that feeling or pressure to feel like you have to hide who you are, breaking down barriers, building more authentic, trust-based relationships with your colleagues, perhaps even with your clients, and therefore making you more productive. All of this, at the end of the day, I think one of the greatest rewards of being out and authenticity at work is the self-esteem that you get for being able to do your job in an atmosphere where you get to be known for who you truly are and valued for that. That is an incredible payback personally and professionally. So how do we tap into this power, right? One of the things I want to bring up is being out at work isn't necessarily for everyone. Even though there are all these rewards to it, I think that we all have to determine whether or not that's our priority in that particular time. So you have to take stock of what's important to you. Self-disclosure really is a self-governed place. And so if you want to work at X company and X, you've been pursuing that all through your college career in building your resume, and X company is not known for being the most inclusive or progressive culture. In fact, perhaps it's a very conservative culture. You might have to trade off whether or not being out is as important to you as working in that particular company. If you work rurally and live in a state that is not particularly as progressive in its laws, Massachusetts is an incredible state for LGBTQ people. Alabama is not. You can look across the states and see quite a wide variety of laws and the status of those laws. And so, where you want to live and feeds into what options are going to perhaps be available to you in terms of employers. So you have to trade all of these things off. You have to take your own inventory around this. If you are looking to come out at work, whether it's at your current company or thinking about prospective employers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute as well, take a look at what the LGBTQ inclusion landscape looks like at that company. What are their policies? What are their benefits? And what kind of profile of out people do they have? Do they have an LGBT or LGBTQ employee network? Many companies do. If you are at a company that doesn't have any of these things, all is not lost, right? We can talk about how you might advocate for change at your existing company. If you are on the line and you are on the employer side, maybe you're a manager, HR professional, this is a moment to also think about how you're tapping into the power of authenticity. Are you getting the most out of your LGBTQ employees by building a warm, welcoming workplace environment for them? And what does that mean? You have to look at workplace policy, workplace practice, benefits, but then also the culture. What are we doing to create a welcoming environment and culture in the workplace? So let's talk a little bit about finding inclusive employers and the metrics that we look at in order to kind of take stock of that and some of the upsides and downsides of those metrics. One is just alluding, as I did a moment ago, that as we look across the United States, we do not have uniform employment protection for LGBTQ people. There are some protections in court cases, there are some protections in interpretations of federal law, but there are no uniform civil rights protections on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity from employment discrimination. And so one of the things that we look for as fundamental in an inclusive employer is that they put those workplace protections in place. We do have some resources at HRC. There's a guide called Generation Equality Guide to Entering the Workplace. I will say it is mostly student focused, but it's a good read if you're trying to kind of suss out those points of introspection for your own values and thinking about what it means to disclose in the workplace or disclose your identity in interviewing and so on. And then we also have the Corporate Equality Index, which I mentioned at the beginning of our event as a tool of HRCs. And I'm going to go into the index now. Our Corporate Equality Index began in 2002, and it basically said, it went to our largest employers in the country, the Fortune 500, the AmLaw 2000, and said, look, you don't need to wait for federal civil rights law to create welcoming environments and protections for LGBTQ people. You can do it on your own, and you can do it because there's a business case for doing so. Now, we've talked a little bit about the business case already, so I'm not going to go into that. But basically, over the last 16 years, HRC has worked with these large employers to basically participate in a survey every year where we produce a report that benchmarks their workplace policies, practices, and benefits relevant to LGBTQ workers. And in this year in our index, we have 609 companies that have a 100% score on our index. Just to give you a benchmark, in 2002 when we started, only 13 companies had that distinction. So a lot of progress in the private sector for embracing LGBTQ workers. One of the reasons is also our buying power. It's important to note that we are a powerful market constituency, and so businesses want to tap into us as buyers as well as employees. So one of the things that we have is a buyer's guide that breaks out our Corporate Equality Index employers into their brand identities. And you can even download an app where you can be at the grocery store and look up a Procter & Gamble product and see their score on the CEI as you're looking to make your purchasing decisions. Now, our index measures what we call the building blocks of equality. The fundamental pieces are non-discrimination protections, equitable benefits, and then internal and external metrics of engagement for internal engagement with employees around education and accountability, and external engagement with the LGBTQ community. So what does that look like? Well, I just want to put up a few points of progress, if you will, around building workplace protections. Sexual orientation. When we started the CEI, only 92% of our 319 companies had those protections. Today, 99% of our 947 participating companies have those. Let's look at gender identity, or protections for transgender and genderqueer people. 5% in 2002, 97% today. Now, what this tells you is this isn't just trend, it is standard operating practice of America's largest, most successful businesses today. Let's look at equitable benefits. And before I even go into this, let me just say, why are benefits so important? Well, in the United States, certainly not only because benefits are important, but I'll also say in the United States, we get so much of our total compensation through benefits that if I, as a transgender man, and I am a transgender man, if I, as a transgender man, don't have access to transgender inclusive healthcare coverage through my workplace, you're asking me to take home about 22 cents less on the dollar in terms of my total compensation than my non-transgender colleague. So it's not just access to those benefits or the right thing to do or the nice thing to do. It's about fair and equitable compensation. One of the things we do at HRC is produce those guidance for employers on how to be more inclusive. This is our trans inclusion toolkit for employers. One of the things that we help employers do is put in workplace practices like guidelines to help employees transition on the job, or have written guidance around restroom policy, dress code policy, locker room policy, all those kind of things that might affect your transitioning employees. And so you can see here the number of employers that now have these written guidelines has grown consistently over time. Some of the things that the CEI also examines, I mentioned those internal and external efforts. This is things like diversity training, whether or not a company has an LGBT employee group or diversity council. External efforts are things like supplier diversity programs or even community engagement and philanthropy. So all of these things are part of the CEI benchmark. So what does this all mean, right? Basically, the CEI, the Corporate Equality Index, is a really good measurement of workplace policy, workplace practices, and equitable benefits. It is setting the foundation for a good culture and a good day-to-day experience. It doesn't actually measure that. It sets kind of the ground floor, if you will, for a company to do the work to create that good, warm, welcoming culture, and for an individual LGBTQ person to have a good day-to-day experience in the workplace. So what it means is that as a job seeker, you can leverage the Corporate Equality Index as part of your homework and research on prospective employers around what are their policies, practices, and benefits. You're going to have to do additional research to kind of scratch under the surface and get to what the culture's like, right? That's harder to do and that's about any workplace culture, but it's harder to do. And how do you do that, right? Look at whether or not they do inclusive ads. Are they open? Are they market facing with their inclusive efforts? Do they take stances on LGBTQ public policy? What does the news say? Do they have a court cases pending? A lot of court cases pending, right? So you can kind of look at that through the lens of research. You do need to moderate your expectations sometimes. There are, real differences from industry or region around what might be an inclusive employer. That's not to say there aren't great employers in states that aren't considered particularly welcoming. So Texas, for example, it doesn't mean there aren't great welcoming employers out there. There are, and many of them, and that's true across our country. But it is also true that if you are going to work in a private sector military think tank, that it probably has a relatively conservative culture, and that's something to take into account. So that's just an example, as opposed to, let's say, Google, right? So you have to moderate your expectations as a job seeker. And then lastly, getting at culture really a lot, you have to get into your informational interviews. I know you work with the career folks at UMass when you're a student. You can continue to work with the support that they have for alumni. Use your alumni networks, use your LGBT networks. Ask companies whether or not they have an LGBTQ employee network, or do research online to see if they do, and ask to speak directly to those folks. So the more that you can get those informational interviews going, the more likely you are to get a better glimpse into the day-to-day culture of an organization. If those employers aren't in the CEI, you can still do those same pieces around research. You can even research their policies to some degree. A big thing to look for is their EEO statement and non-discrimination policy itself, that normally will live on their website and in their job ads, and see if they include sexual orientation and gender identity in their non-discrimination policy. What about if you're already working somewhere and it's not in the CEI and you're not sure what the policies are, or you know what the policies are and they aren't particularly that great and you want to make improvement? How can you advocate for change? I always like to say the first step is to get a posse. Try to find your likely allies. Maybe it's other LGBTQ folks that you know at work. Maybe it's ally-identified folks. Maybe you do have an Office of Diversity and Inclusion or an HR person who's charged with diversity at your workplace. All of these people are likely allies. And then you've got to build your business case. You have to take that business case and be able to present it to key stakeholders and decision makers in your organization. You can use the CEI to do benchmarking. You can use all of the business case materials that are on our website, but you got to build it for your company and make a convincing business-based argument for why your company should create change. You got to know that pitch, know the common objections and how to overcome them. Here's a tip. We have all of this on our website, and I'll get to those resources in just a second. So know your pitch and be ready to make that case. You also have to have resilience, right? Stay strong, carry on. This kind of change can take a long time, and you have to take the low-hanging fruit, take the wins where you can get them, and build over time. Many of the companies in the Corporate Equality Index, almost all of them really, they participate in that index driven by employees, driven by LGBTQ employees who drove that case internally and who made that case over time. And sometimes they started with a score of 45, and then they moved to a 55, and then they moved to a 70, right? It took time, and they built it over time. So carry on, fight the good fight. You're making great progress. If you're even starting the conversation in your workplace is an incredible amount of progress. And then lastly, call the cavalry. And that's us at HRC. We're here to help you, but it's also local advocacy organizations. There are many statewide LGBTQ organizations in Massachusetts. It's Freedom Massachusetts, but Mass Equality. But there are many others as well, and they can help you regionally as well, and help you in benchmarking data, help you in overcoming objections, and so on. And then lastly, I want to say to our recruiters or talent folks on the line, managers, know your own policies, know your own workplace, know what you have around these key indicators of inclusion. And think about how you can recruit specifically to the LGBTQ community, either through network and network effects, or through participating in LGBTQ specific job fair opportunities, of which there are many. And now, finally, I'm going to open it up for questions. And while we go to questions, I'll toss it back to Megan and Karen to help with that. I'm going to put up a slide that has a whole bunch of short links to give you a moment to take a look at those and make a note. Of course, I think we can also send them out as a follow-up email to the seminar today. And also, I invite you all to connect with me on LinkedIn. If there's a question that you want to ask that you feel is particularly sensitive and you don't want to ask it in this environment, find me on LinkedIn, hit me up with an email. We'll connect by email, and we can follow up from there. And now I'll ask Megan to help me out with any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Beck. That was an amazing presentation. I really appreciate it. And I do encourage anyone, if for some reason you did not want to put forth your question today on the webinar, to definitely connect with Beck. He is a wealth of information, and he is very eager to help. We do have a question that came in. It is, I heard that the preferred name spot on applications is a trap. If you put in a name that seems to differ from your legal gender and doesn't seem to be just a nickname, then some employers won't hire you because of that and just find another reason to reject your application. Have you experienced anything to support or disprove that rumor?
Yeah, so here's the thing, right? It depends. If an employer is doing the work to create space for applicants and employees to declare preferred names, that's progress in a sense. And so we want to continue to encourage employers to do that. I would say that employers that are doing that, probably from the top down, mean to be inclusive. The reality is that doesn't mean that that won't go through the hands of a particular recruiter who has a bias that hasn't been addressed, right? But the reality is that workplace bias exists. And so here we are, right? And so this is where we talk about it being a really important self-determined matter to decide whether or not you want to do that. If being out in the application process is a primary value to you, then you should do it. If getting that job is primary and then maybe coming out once you're there, then that's a tactic too, right? And so each individual has to make those choices for themselves, and honestly, they're not easy. I can say that fortunately, and let me say this, if that's the only indicator you have that a company is welcoming, that might be a flag. So if that's what, like if they have a preferred name spot and that's an indicator among many other indicators, right? Like they have an LGBTQ diversity statement on their website, they profile out LGBTQ people on their blog. If they have a lot of other really kind of public-facing efforts, that's also, you have to take those things together as a little more evidence that it might be okay. But again, at the end of the day, you're going to have to decide that for yourself, and that's true for all of us, and that's true over and over again throughout our careers.
Excellent, thank you. So it appears that we don't have any other questions. I guess your presentation was very informative.
Well, I mean, I will say, so here are some of the common questions, right? And I think I can throw out a few of those if you'd like.
Sure.
So one of them would be, should I be out on my resume? Perhaps I am currently a leader of an LGBTQ resource group, or I was a leader in a college level LGBT organization. And so those show professional skills and professional development that I might be interested in highlighting on my resume, but then again, they also reveal my LGBTQ status, or at least an assumption that I have an LGBTQ status because I might identify as an ally. Again, another place of personal self-determination and exploration of what's important to you. Some people do change the references to say civil rights advocacy instead of, they kind of blend the middle ground and kind of hide. They might say they did work in diversity and civil rights advocacy rather than LGBTQ advocacy specifically. There are a couple of different ways to approach it, but that's certainly something to take a look at. Again, thinking you've got to really weigh what's important to you, and also, look at that prospective employer and how they present in terms of being an inclusive employer. The other question that I get a lot is, what if I feel like I was discriminated against in my hiring process or on the job? First of all, in the hiring process, it's worth explore if you believe that you experienced that discrimination or felt some bias in your interview. Perhaps let me give you a what if. Perhaps you revealed your LGBTQ status while you were telling a story in your interview to highlight your leadership skills. And you saw the interviewer's eyebrows go up, their body language change. They didn't say, get out of here, right? There's not like this overt discrimination, but you sense discomfort. And you then sense that that's going to be held against you in the process. It is worth, if that employer is an inclusive employer, if they have an inclusive non-discrimination statement, if they have, policies in place, it's worth going above that recruiter's head and just trying to express that, right? Asking to speak to the recruiter in a follow-up along with their manager or the leader of diversity recruiting, or the leader of talent management, and even approach it from, hey, I was discriminated against, but hey, I want to have feedback on my interview. I want to know more about why I wasn't chosen, and I want to express that this is what I experienced. And that probably won't get you the job, but it will start to educate employers that, hey, we notice when people have uncomfortable reactions to us, and that's a problem, right? And so if you, it's worth it to try to go down those paths, at least for your own self-esteem. And it's also important to get feedback about why you didn't get a job. Now, if you are in a job and you're experiencing discrimination or harassment because of your LGBTQ status, or you perceive it, or you're experiencing, again, not those blatant, actionable, someone wrote a derogatory term on your, desk or something. Perhaps it's much more subtle than that. Then what do, right? We encourage people to try to take that. If you have protections, now again, if you don't have sexual orientation and gender identity protections in your employer's non-discrimination statement, and if your state doesn't have them, you're going to want to talk to a lawyer before you do anything. But if you do have those protections in place, and if your state does, then you might want to try to go through your HR channels first. Talk to HR, talk to the HR business partner assigned to your unit, talk to the diversity and inclusion office if you have one. And if you're not getting satisfaction, then reach out for legal assistance. And the best sources to start with are places like Lambda Legal, the ACLU, and gay and lesbian advocates and defenders there in Massachusetts. So those are great places to start if you need legal assistance. So hopefully that answered a couple of the most common questions that we get.
That's excellent. So a couple more items then. We'll jump onto our side one more time. All right, so we thank you all for joining us today. In addition to the webinars, the Alumni Association has a variety of resources to support you in navigating a career transition or advancing in your current profession. The Alumni Association works to connect you with the advice, guidance, and networking opportunities to help you in your career. Some examples include the UMass Amherst Alumni Advisors, connecting you with experienced alumni advisors in your field for career advice, resume feedback, and mock interviews. Career counseling and coaching offered at discounted rates from alumni career counselors and coaches with a variety of specializations. And events and programs throughout the year to network with fellow alumni. You can view upcoming events at umassalumni.com/events. In addition to live webinars like today's program, we provide alumni access to a comprehensive library of on-demand webinars as well. Thank you again for participating in today's webinar hosted by the UMass Amherst Alumni Association and our LGBTQ Alumni Network. And thank you to Beck for sharing your expertise with us today. Have a great day and go UMass.